We begin with the Kyle Rittenhouse homicide trial, now in the hands of the jury, which will begin deliberations this morning.
Rittenhouse faces 5 charges, including intentional homicide, after killing 2 men and injuring a third last.
You cannot claim self-defense against a danger you create. That's critical right here. If you're the one who is threatening others, you lose the right to claim self-defense.
Kyle Rittenhouse shot Mr. Rosenbaum because he was attacking Kyle. Every person who was shot was attacking Kyle. One with a skateboard, one with his hands, one with his feet, one with a gun.
And there they were yesterday, the prosecution and defense making their closing arguments. Joining us now, NBC News legal analyst and former U.S. Attorney Barbara McQuaid, and on the ground in Kenosha, Wisconsin, NBC News correspondent Ellison Barber. Good morning to you both. And Ellison, we're going to start with you. The prosecution and the defense, they had their final opportunity to make their case before the jury. Tell us, what were some of the highlights from their closing arguments?
So the prosecution began their closing arguments by asking the jury to ask themselves, why was Kyle Rittenhouse really in Kenosha? They say he came from out of town, that he did not know this business that he was said to be protecting, Car Source, at all prior to the evening, and that the owners themselves didn't care enough to stay, and that they had cleared everything out for the most part and had left by that point. They focused a lot on drone video from the very first shooting involving Joseph Rosenbaum. It's video that came into the trial fairly late compared to other videos, but the prosecution has really zeroed in on that, playing it again and again, slowing it down. They say it shows Kyle Rittenhouse walking up to that Car Source area where he's about to interact in moments with Joseph Rosenbaum, putting down a fire extinguisher he had in his hand, and then pointing his rifle at a couple that was nearby, and then also Rosenbaum. Then they say what happened next was that Rosenbaum gave chase. They're trying to convince the jury that that moment right there triggered everything else, and that in that moment, Kyle Rittenhouse was provoking Rosenbaum, and therefore he lost the right to self-defense. Now, the defense argued that the video didn't show that, or at times it was not clear, or other video. They focused a lot on attacking the credibility of some of the witnesses and the 3 individuals who were shot here, saying that Rosenbaum was a crazy guy, a bad guy, saying he was not chasing Kyle Rittenhouse down that night to give him a key to the city, and that Kyle Rittenhouse had no choice but to use lethal force to protect himself. Vicki, Savannah.
And Barbara, let's bring you in here. So Judge Schrader has already gotten a lot of attention during this trial, lashing out at the prosecution at times over judicial procedure. The judge's instructions to the jury, which were delivered before closing arguments yesterday, were also contentious. Let's listen to that.
I just worry that the more we deviate from these standard instructions, the more we get into these issues. I think we should stick with what you drafted, which has been sent to the parties. We've all agreed on them, and I am leery of any additional language that hasn't been cleared by the parties and could cause further confusion.
So can you walk us through the instructions that the judge gave and why this step is so important to a trial?
Yes, well, as you heard, in this case, the law is actually a little bit complicated under Wisconsin law because it sort of gives self-defense. It takes it away if you provoke, but then it kind of gives it back if you thought you had no other alternative. In that way, it's a little bit unusual. It also does not account for what's known as imperfect self-defense, which says even if what you did was unreasonable, if you genuinely believed it was necessary, that is a defense to the highest crimes, but not to these lesser included crimes. And that's not available. They only have what's called perfect self-defense in Wisconsin. So it is complicated. There are a number of charges, and each of those has a number of lesser included offenses. The thing I fault the judge for here is not working this out before he began reading it to the jury. Usually there are issues. The parties will disagree about what exactly should be read to the jury because it really is important that they get the law correct as they apply it. But that's why you want to get it all done in one reading and not have a disjointed reading because you get interrupted along the way. I think the judge was right that there was a problem, but I think they should have worked it out before they started reading it.
Barbara, thank you. Ellison, you've been following this very closely. The judge threw out one of the charges, a misdemeanor weapons charge, but said he will allow the jury to consider other lesser charges. So how does this change the equation for the prosecution and the defense, and now for the jury who has to decide this verdict?
Well, so that misdemeanor charge, which was the illegal possession of a weapon by a minor, that was something that had been discussed, and the defense had wanted to have that removed prior to heading into the trial. But it was surprising that the judge made this decision so last minute. Basically, what they argued was that there was a technicality in the Wisconsin statute, and that law specifically applies to short-barreled shotguns or rifles, and that Kyle Rittenhouse had a long barrel. So that's ultimately what came into play there. That, though, was a charge that legal experts have consistently said was going to be kind of the easiest, most simply proven charge for the prosecution to get a conviction on here. So they lost that. That being said, the 5 charges, the 5 counts that still remain, those are all felony charges, 3 of them related to homicides. The first 3, the judge decided that he would not allow any lesser charges to be considered, even though the prosecution did ask. But on count 4 and 5, they are having lesser charges that they can consider. So count 4, they can look, and the first one that relates to the shooting of Anthony Huber. If they cannot reach a consensus and agreement on first-degree intentional homicide, they can move to 2 other lesser charges related to that. Same deal in the shooting of Gage Grosskreutz, the sole person who survived. Guys.
And Barbara, quickly before we let you go, a process question here. So 18 jurors heard this case, but only 12 will deliberate and then potentially reach that verdict. How are those 12 jurors decided?
They'll just pull the names at random. They'll be selected. You know, ordinarily that's very common to have a few extra alternates in case people get sick along the way. But they'll be selected randomly from these 18, and 6 will be told to stand by in case deliberations take such time and somebody has to drop out.
All right, Barbara McQuaid and Ellison Barber, thank you so much for helping us through this morning.
And staying in Kenosha, residents and businesses are keeping a close eye on the Rittenhouse trial as they brace for the possibility of protests and violence. NBC News correspondent Shaquille Brewster shows us how the city is preparing for the outcome of the verdict.
City on edge. Kenosha bracing for a verdict in the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. Governor Tony Evers mobilizing 500 National Guard members in preparation of the potential outcome. In a statement saying, quote, "I urge folks who are otherwise not from the area to please respect the community by reconsidering any plans to travel there, and encourage those who might choose to assemble and exercise their First Amendment rights to do so safely and peacefully." Officials and businesses fearing a repeat of the violence that took place in August of last year after the police shooting of Jacob Blake, leaving 100 businesses damaged and 2 dead in the shooting that has Rittenhouse on trial. Stores and restaurants now boarded up in anticipation of potential crowds and unrest. Some have been this way since those riots. The people of Kenosha bracing for more violence as they grapple with the pain of what has already happened.
Hurt because of the whole scenario. It started with Jacob Blake, and now it's ending with Kyle Rittenhouse. I do not like him, but I think he should be found not guilty. I think the kid's a punk. I think he was here looking for trouble, and he found it.
Scott Anderson saying the city is still recovering and echoing the calls for peace.
But I don't want to see it again. I do not want to see it again. It broke my heart.
Yeah, he's not alone there. And that was Shaquille Brewster reporting for us from Kenosha.
President Biden's $1 trillion infrastructure bill has been finally signed into law, ending a hard-fought battle to push through one of the signature items on his agenda. In a signing ceremony yesterday, the president praised bipartisan efforts to get the legislation over the line and said it would transform the lives of Americans.
Here in Washington, we've heard countless speeches and promises and white papers from experts. But today, we're finally getting this done. So my message to the American people is this: America's moving again, and your life is going to change for the better.
Soon after the signing, President Biden attended a virtual meeting with China's President Xi Jinping in a longer-than-expected summit aimed at easing tensions between the world's most powerful nations. The leaders discussed topics including competition, climate change, and Taiwan. NBC News White House correspondent Mike Nemely joins us now, along with NBC News foreign correspondent Janice Mackey-Frayer. who's in Beijing. Good morning to both of you. Mike, I'll start things off with you. So the president will be relieved to finally push through one of his big ticket policies officially here. And yesterday's ceremony was an opportunity also to tout the bipartisan nature of this bill, as I mentioned. Did he succeed in doing that? And what's next on the agenda? What about the social safety net package?
Yeah, good morning, Savannah. I was out on the South Lawn for what was a lengthy program on a very brisk Washington afternoon, and it was interesting to hear the different speakers as part of the program. For instance, Vice President Harris and Speaker Pelosi really using their remarks to highlight the historic nature of this accomplishment. They were comparing what the president signed into law to, for instance, the Transcontinental Railroad under Abraham Lincoln or the Interstate Highway Project under President Eisenhower. But when we heard from the president himself, he spoke much more directly to the American people, acknowledging the pain many are feeling in their pocketbooks right now, stressing the fact that the American people, when we work together, can accomplish big things. And yes, now the focus turns to the next part of his agenda. The White House is saying that they are confident that the larger reconciliation package will be moving forward. And that was another part of what we heard from so many of the officials yesterday, saying this is only the beginning of what is a big step forward for the administration.
And Mike, the other thing we mentioned here, soon after that signing, the president sat down for a virtual meeting with his Chinese counterpart. Were there any major breakthroughs there?
Well, what was so interesting is every conversation I had with the White House before this meeting, they were downplaying expectations of what we call deliverables, of any tangible sort of announcements that might come out in terms of what these two leaders might break through on substance. But what they did say and what they stressed was that because President Xi has really consolidated power so much in China, these direct leader-to-leader conversations are so important. Here was the president laying out what his hopes were at the top of that meeting.
It seems to me we need to establish some common sense guardrails to be clear and honest where we disagree and work together where interests intersect, especially on vital global issues like climate change. We have a responsibility to the world as well as to our people. It's why we believe, and you and I have talked about this, all countries have to play by the same rules of the road.
Now, what we did hear from White House officials afterwards was that the subject of Taiwan was probably one of the major points of conflict in this conversation. The White House, the president, in his conversation with President Xi, underscoring that the United States still subscribed to the one China policy, but urging China not to do anything that would disrupt the status quo, a real source of tension right now.
And Janice, let's bring you in here and keep on this conversation. So Chinese state media had some particularly interesting insight into the conversation on Taiwan. What is President Xi reported to have said about that, and what's the reaction been like over there to this meeting in general?
Well, most of the headlines have been emphasizing President Biden's comments on Taiwan, specifically that the U.S. does not support Taiwan independence. And it's getting hashtagged all over social media and really playing up this sense of strength in the Chinese position. Remember, Beijing went into this meeting expecting that President Xi would tell President Biden that Taiwan is a red line for China. They see this as a sovereignty issue. They say there will be reunification in the foreseeable future, no matter the cost. President Xi apparently blamed the tension with Taiwan these days over on the authorities in Taiwan, the government in Taiwan, saying that they were the ones who were fishing for U.S. support for an independence agenda. He went on to say, quote, "Such moves are extremely dangerous," he reportedly said. "Just like playing with fire, whoever plays with fire will get burned." This is according to state media outlet, the Global Times. The thing is, for the U.S., nothing has changed in the U.S. position on Taiwan. And that line about independence, senior officials told us, have always been part of the U.S. policy. It's just not part of the U.S. statement today. The U.S. strongly opposing unilateral efforts to change the status quo, it says, or to undermine peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. So as Mike mentioned as well, Taiwan really dominating the conversation in this meeting today, and neither side appearing to move an inch.
Now, Janice, also, President Xi called Biden his old friend in that video we just played there a moment ago from the meeting. We saw them waving, smiling at each other. I mean, there appeared to be some effort on both sides of this to convey warmth towards each other. What would China like to see from its relationship with the U.S. going forward?
Well, they are not strangers. They've known each other for several years. There is this personal familiarity. When President Biden was here, they ate noodles together and they traveled around. And she did refer to him today as an old friend. But that was then. And the U.S.-China relationship is far more complicated now. And in many ways, it carries higher stakes. We also have to remember that Xi Jinping is coming into this meeting with unprecedented power here. Just last week, rewriting Communist Party history to be elevated to the status of the leader who will carry China into the next era of being a superpower. So that's bound to have some friction with the United States. Both sides went into this hoping to manage this stiff competition that has pushed relations to a very rocky place in history. And as President Biden said, to assure that the lines of communication are open enough that they don't find the two nations veering into conflict.
All right, Janice Mackey-Fair, Mike Memoli, thank you both so much.
Former Trump advisor Steve Bannon will be back in court on Thursday, where he's expected to enter a plea after being charged with 2 counts of contempt of Congress. Bannon surrendered to authorities yesterday after a federal grand jury indicted him for refusing to answer questions in the House committee's January 6th investigation. NBC News Justice correspondent Pete Williams has more on what's next for Steve Bannon.
Steve Bannon turned himself into the FBI mobbed by cameras, his escorts clearing a path.
Excuse me.
One of those cameras was actually his, live streaming on his social media site.
Okay, we got the Hispanics coming on our side, African Americans coming on our side. We're taking down the Biden regime.
His more immediate challenge is a federal grand jury indictment, 2 counts charging contempt of Congress for refusing to produce documents or show up for questioning by the House committee investigating the January 6th riot at the U.S. Capitol. During a brief hearing in federal court, he was formally advised of the charges, released, and will enter a plea Thursday. Outside the courthouse, a defiant Bannon said he'll fight the charges, which he called politically motivated.
I'm telling you right now, this is going to be the misdemeanor from hell for Merrick Garland, Nancy Pelosi, and Joe Biden.
Bannon is the only former Trump White House aide subpoenaed who has totally refused to cooperate because the former president asserted executive privilege. 15 others have been subpoenaed.
If they're willing to talk to the committee about non-privileged matters, if they're willing to negotiate with the committee rather than just make a blanket assertion of privilege, they don't really have anything to fear. They won't be charged.
We now have a clearer idea of what Steve Bannon's defense will be. One key element will be this, that he will argue that he was simply following the advice of his lawyers when he declined to even show up to answer the House committee's questions. And in some past contempt cases, that defense has been a successful one. Savannah, Vicki?
Pete Williams, thank you so much.
Turning now to the state of the coronavirus in Europe, after nearly 2 million cases were reported across the region just last week. Countries there are now introducing restrictions on activities not seen since the early days of the pandemic. Austria has re-implemented a full-scale lockdown for unvaccinated citizens, while a partial lockdown is underway in the Netherlands, with businesses and restaurants closing early to try to get ahead of a spike in cases. The restrictive policies in Europe come as cases here in the U.S. remain elevated heading into the busy holiday travel season. Let's bring in Dr. Amish Adalja for more on these new developments. Dr. Adalja is a senior scholar at Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security. Doctor, good morning. So we so appreciate how straight with us you always are. So I just want to ask you, because so many of these headlines feel back and forth. It feels like we're seeing there's good news. We are in a better place with cases. Vaccination rates are going up. Boosters will soon be available to more people. But then we hear stuff like this, cases remaining elevated. And obviously we see what's going on in Europe right now, with some countries experiencing their worst surge in months. So is the U.S. in good shape heading into the winter months? Where do you think we're at right now?
You have to realize that we're still going to see an acceleration of cases because there's not enough people vaccinated. It's getting colder. People are going to go indoors. The goal has always been to keep those cases from translating into hospitalizations and deaths. And I do think because we've got maybe 58, 60% of the population fully vaccinated, we have monoclonal antibodies, we have antivirals that are on the cusp of being approved, and we've got some amount of the population that has immunity from prior infection. We hopefully won't see the cases that we're inevitably going to see translate into hospitals in trouble. That remains to be seen. There may be pockets of the country where there's high-risk people who haven't been vaccinated, where hospitals are going to struggle, just like we saw during the Delta surge. So I think there's a little bit of uncertainty of where this is going to go. But the thing is, we have the tool to stop this or to blunt this. It's just getting more people vaccinated. And we know that there's going to be transmission over holidays. The best way to make that holiday safe is to be vaccinated.
So I want to ask you a question specifically about that and use some examples from a new report out to kind of walk us through what exactly is happening here. So this is from NBC News. It's detailing a spike in cases among unvaccinated Americans in the New England area. I think we might have a graphic for you here. Here we go. So New England COVID cases rise as Delta hits the unvaccinated. Vermont and New Hampshire, as you can see there, hit particularly hard. But Vermont, doctor, is one of the most vaccinated states in the U.S. So what does that mean? Are these breakthrough cases then? How is an area with, according to that most recent article from NBC News, 72% of residents fully vaccinated seeing a spike like that?
Well, 72 is not 100% or not 90%. And some of the European countries that have been able to stave off this surge have vaccination rates that are around 90%, for example, places like Portugal. So it's not enough for the more contagious variant. And what's happening is that this virus is moving through the unvaccinated population. And unvaccinated people tend to cluster together. They tend to live in the same counties. They tend to interact with each other. And that's where that virus is finding a hold. So it's not really impacting the vaccinated community to the degree that it's impacting the unvaccinated community. And it remains true that if you're unvaccinated, the Delta variant is going to find you. You're going to get infected. This virus is too contagious. So the best thing to do is to be vaccinated. And those states that are resting on those high vaccination numbers, they're still going to have their unvaccinated population get hit because it's not high enough.
And Doctor, quickly, let's talk about booster shots, something that people who are vaccinated are interested in. So now we're hearing that New York City and 3 other states, California, Colorado, New Mexico, are moving ahead with authorizing booster shots for all adults. And that's even though federal health agencies have not yet signed off on it. Is that the safest way of getting boosters out there for those who want them? And will more cities follow along with this? What do you think about that?
There's not much harm to getting a booster, but what you want to really focus on is where the benefit is for boosters. And I think that's the high-risk individuals, people above the age of 65, people with high-risk conditions, and those who got the J&J vaccine. But I understand that local public health authorities are frustrated because booster messaging has been really convoluted and mixed from the White House versus the CDC versus the FDA. So they want a simple solution. But I think those high-risk groups where boosters are absolutely necessary. For other healthy people, it's not going to harm you, but the benefit may be marginal. But we probably will see expansion of boosters, even though the benefit is really in a restricted group of people.
All right, Dr. Amish Adalja, always great to have you. Thank you so much. Now, days of heavy rainfall and high winds led to major flooding in Washington state on Monday.
Bill Cairns joins us now with the latest updates. Hey, good morning, Bill.
Yeah, good morning. Scary situations. This is right along the border of British Columbia and northern Washington state. I mean, they had incredible amounts of rain. Even Seattle's had 7 inches of rain this month. And I know areas to the north there got worse. Interstate 5 had a mudslide that is closed. We've had numerous communities that have been cut off. The town of Sumas had the downtown flooded. On the British Columbia side, the town of Vernon of 7,000 people got flooded out, all evacuated. You can see the pictures there, just how severe this has been. Many people had to be rescued by boats from their homes, and in some cases, people were on the second floors of their homes. There is one report of one van that was washed down a creek that is missing that they are still looking for. So the flash flood watch has expired, but those areas in red are still rivers that are in flood stage. Again, the worst of it is north of Seattle, and as I said, I-5 is closed because of a large mudslide up around Bellingham, and there's no word how long that's going to take for the major interstate to be reopened. So this storm that brought that heavy rain is now moving through the northern plains. It is going to be a huge wind maker today and tomorrow through the northern plains. We have high wind warnings that cover portions of 4 states and just about all of Montana. And we could see in some of the high elevations gusts up to 100 miles per hour. So we're talking down trees, some minor structural damage, and power outages for a few locations. And here's some of what we're predicting. Here's the wind gusts that are expected for some of the big cities. You notice Billings up to 60, Glasgow 61, and it will be still pretty windy all the way into areas of the Dakotas. So for today's forecast, we're still chilly in the east. We still have record highs in some portions of the southern plains. So we got a little bit of everything except snow. We don't have too much snow on the map today, and that's just fine with me.
Yeah, not quite time yet. All right, Bill, thank you so much. See you next hour.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.